Okay, so here is a quick lecture over maple syrup processing and how maple syrup is made. The real, actual, real maple syrup, not Mrs. Butterworth, that fake lady, but actual real maple syrup. So, springtime is your window of opportunity to make and process maple syrup, but it's got to be early spring. Now, the key here when we're talking about real maple syrup is working with plants that are maple, trees, woody plants or trees, maple trees. These are classified under Kingdom Plantae, down into the phylum Anthophyta. Sometimes you'll see the term division used here, both acceptable. Division is more preferred by the botanical folks, but phylum Anthophyta does often work for the general layman. Sometimes we will use the phylum Magnoliophyta as well as Anthophyta. So some interchangeable terms here for our maples when we're talking about at the phylum level. But you have to identify a maple tree and know that it's a maple tree in order to get maple syrup. So moving further down the classification level, from phylum we would move down to class, class Eudicotyledon. Sometimes people just call them the dicots. Those are maples. They will be underneath that class. They're not the only member of class Eudicotyledon. There's lots of other plants, but our focus here is the maple tree. So maples, there's a bunch of different species. There's sugar maple, there's silver maple, there's red maple, there's black maple. The primary maples you want, if you have access to them, are sugar maples, hence the name, sugar. And we can also use red maples. People try to lean away from the black maple, just not as good of a syrup, but if it's the only tree you have access to, it might be worth trying. So what we're doing with maple trees to get maple syrup is we're harvesting the sap, the fluid that flows through the maple tree. Think of it as the bloodstream of the maple tree. Now, during winter, maple trees go dormant. They basically go to sleep. They've dropped all their leaves back in October or November, and they're in a period of dormancy. All of the nutrients and fluid has drained down into the root system. This is why if you go to a maple tree in the winter and you break a branch, it snaps like it's a dry twig because there's no sap in it. If the sap was still in the branches when we get 10 degrees out in January for 7 or 8 days, it would freeze the branch and it would destroy it because as water freezes, it expands. So the cells in the branches would be destroyed because of the expansion of the water when it freezes. So all the sap drains down into the root system. So what we have to watch for in early spring is the shifting in temperatures. Here's your monthly temperature chart for Petersburg, Illinois, Central Illinois. It's going to be very, very similar here. And February is usually the prime time to start paying attention to this. What we're looking for is the sap flow. When does sap start to flow? So there's some triggers here. Soil temperature is going to go up. And the days are above freezing and the nights drop back down below freezing. So if you have 6 or 8 hours or 10 hours during the day where it's above freezing, that's starting to thaw the soil. The sap starts to flow. Ideally, you want that above 32 during the day, down below 32 at night for a period of several weeks. That's going to be your prime time to collect sap. So what's happening here is as that ground temperature warms up, the water starts to move because it now becomes liquid water. And the water starts to move up into the root system. And let me go to blue. And then because of those properties of water, water is cohesive, it's adhesive, the water starts to move up the trunk of the tree, up the conduction system of the tree, what we call the xylem. As the water's moving up, it's carrying the different nutrients. So the different nutrients, the sugars, the minerals, etc., are what give maple syrup its flavor. It's real flavor here. So again, temperature is the issue. Warm days, below freezing at night, will cause conduction of sap to start moving up the tree, up the trunk of the tree, or the internal part of the tree. So xylem are the conduction tubes that carry the sap upward, and then phloem will be the conduction tubes that carry the nutrients downward. Phloem really isn't playing a big role right now because we don't have nutrients being produced. That's going to come in the picture when photosynthesis starts happening. You got to have your leaves out, which is going to be much later, probably into April, before we start seeing leaves on the trees. So right now it's all about water, sap, so water, nutrients, minerals moving up from the soil up to the trunk and up into the branches of the trees. Okay, so here's a quick little video of what our syrup or sap collection operation looks like. So what we have here is we've tagged all the trees. We use red flagging tape so we know which maple trees to come back to tap. The tree has to be of a certain diameter in order to draw sap from it. Otherwise, it's not healthy on the tree. And in the background, you can see jugs and buckets in the woods. Those are all trees we have taps in. We then put a line into the tree or a tap, and then a hose that runs down to that green bucket or big water jug, whatever container you have to collect sap. I like to use 5-gallon containers because then I don't have to worry about checking my buckets every so many days. I can leave them for over a week, come back, and they're usually not going to be overflowing. Okay, so this gives you an idea of what the woods look like the time of year you're collecting sap. There's nothing growing, no greenery, because it's still too cold. And each of those buckets placed out there, those are our sap collection buckets. So each of the trees with a bucket is a maple tree that's large enough to collect sap from. So you want at least about 12 to 14 inch circumference for your size of your tree to put one tap in. You get a much bigger tree, you can put 2 taps in. Huge maple trees, you can even put 3 taps in. It's all relative to the size of the tree with how many taps you can put into it and how much sap you can collect from it. Okay, so here's a little bit better view of what it looks like when we're collecting the sap. That's just a 5-gallon water bucket, and if you can see the fluid in it, that is the sap. Now, what I want you to look at here is the canopy. Maple trees that are taller, that have a larger canopy, will produce greater amounts of sap. The other thing to point out is this big tap root right next to the bucket, or the collection jug there. Ideally, you go on the south side of the tree and you find that big tap root that is going to draw in a large amount of nutrients, and you put your sap tap, that little blue thing in the side of the tree with the hose on it, you put that in the tree above the main tap root. It's the same as finding the vein in your arm when you're trying to do a blood draw versus just sticking it in randomly. So you look for certain signs and anatomical features about these trees to know what's the best place to do this, to give you your greatest collection of sap, but also for the health of the tree, because you're drilling a hole into the side of this tree. When you take the tap out, the tree needs to heal that hole so it doesn't get an infection, fungus doesn't get in there, insects don't go in there. So you try to think long term about the longevity and the health of the tree if you want to continue to do this. Okay, so this is to give you a feel for what sap looks like. So apologize for bouncing around. I'm trying to open the bucket and hold the camera, but there's a good view of what it looks like, the setup and design. And then we try to make sure those lids are sealed. so rain doesn't get in there, all sorts of other stuff. So again, there I am trying to manage too many things. Ugh, I hate those lids. But this is what the sap looks like. Water. It's not syrup. It's water. You drink it, you're drinking water with a tiny, tiny little hint of flavor in it. But nothing I would say, oh, this is great stuff to drink. Okay, so this has nothing to do with maple syrup, but I just can't help it when I'm out in nature looking at things. I look at all things. That's my background as an ecologist. I don't just focus on one thing. But think about these plants. What are these plants? Not the dead, dried brown stuff, but the green stuff. What is it? And then which portion of the life cycle are you looking at right there? That should hopefully make you guys remember back to the early plants that we've talked about. Okay, so how do we go from sap, which looks like water, down to syrup I'm going to put on my pancakes? Evaporation, boiling. Roughly, and there's a spectrum here, but roughly it will take 60 to 70 gallons of sap to equal 1 gallon of syrup. So reduce that down to more practical terms. If you have a 16-ounce glass, like a pint glass, it takes approximately 7.5 gallons, so 7.5 milk jugs, to equal one 16-ounce glass or jar of syrup. So this is why real maple syrup costs so much. So you're hauling out thousands of pounds of liquid out of the woods and then boiling it for hours and hours and hours to reduce it down to the actual syrup. So it's a very dilute solution when it's in the tree, and we concentrate it by evaporating the water off. So again, you're talking hours to reduce sap down to syrup. Now, what I want you to think about, here's the economics of it. Mrs. Butterworth, she's cheap. $1.87 for a bottle of Mrs. Butterworth. But look at her ingredient label. High fructose corn syrup. Corn syrup, water, salt, cellulose gum, molasses, natural and artificial flavor. That's where they try to make it taste like maple. And then all sorts of stuff you can't even pronounce the name of. And of course, citric acid. So, this is why Mrs. Butterworth is so cheap. She is not made from maple syrup or maple sap. She's made from corn sugar. This is also why you eat a bunch of that, you put it on your pancakes, and you feel like you go into a diabetic coma afterwards and you're falling asleep because of the massive amount of fructose your body is trying to process. Your pancreas is going into overtime trying to pump out insulin, and you feel terrible after you eat that big stack of pancakes covered with Mrs. Butterworth. Flip it and go to real maple syrup. Okay, this is what our jars look like after we processed. You do not have that level of sugar. It's not high fructose. It's natural sugar. Very different flavor because it's real maple flavoring versus fake and artificial. So it's a whole different product. Can't even compare the two. You can't put them on an equal scale and say, oh, these are both equal to each other. They're not. They're absolutely different products. One's made from corn syrup. The other one is made from the sap of the tree. The challenge is, this is why maple syrup, real stuff, is far more expensive because of the amount of energy, labor, time, etc. it takes to process it. But nutritionally, far better for you than Mrs. Butterworth. So, tough thing we always have to balance out. And to leave you guys with one last little thought, depending on if you saw the movie, think about how much he likes syrup. Syrup on everything. And so I encourage you, get a bottle of the real stuff, try it, and experience real maple syrup.